again came from this notion that science cut loose from community involvement could become violent. And so the scientist was often portrayed as a kind of scientist gone berserk, or a scientist without humanity. Interestingly enough, I mean, it's a little reductive reading of Frankenstein on the part of many people who approach it in that way. Those who have read it will recall that the reason Frankenstein's monster becomes violent is, in fact, because he's cut off from the love and connection of his creator. So it becomes less, in that way, a comment upon the dangers of science than it does upon the connections of this failure of human connection. So he'll talk about that. He'll also introduce us to another metaphor, another myth of Prometheus. And he pairs Prometheus and Faust, or Faustus. Prometheus we tend to see as somebody we see him, according to the story, who gave fire to human beings, as who introduced them to certain kinds of gifts, offered them gifts that increase the richness of their lives. Of course, Prometheus was then, by the gods, punished. He was bound to a rock and forever had his liver plucked out by birds. But Faustus was one, also became a cautionary tale, who sold his soul to the devil, depending on which accounts you're reading, for the sort of self-aggrandizement. So he's playing again with the kinds of cultural views of science and the distrust of science that we have. He introduces us to the distinction between theism and deism. You recall, a theistic perspective is that which sees God as omnipotent and omniscient. God has created the world. God has delivered laws to the world. God is involved in our lives in very intimate ways at all points. A deistic God essentially sees God as having created the world and then stepped away from it and allows it to function, but without his involvement. Scientists, many of whom would have come out of that or been inclined to that deistic perspective, then would believe that they could come to understand the laws of God, and in some cases to know God's mind, by understanding the way that the world worked, because it worked with a kind of mathematical precision of a good timepiece, for instance, was often the metaphor that was used. What he will do also in this chapter, as he works through sort of the major figures of science, beginning with Bacon and moving up through Newton, for instance, is to talk about the way that science began to move from deduction to induction and to reductionism, that the world could be reduced to, and we could begin to see reality in its smallest forms, and then be able to extrapolate from that and understand something about the laws of nature. He will then work through the major movements in the 19th and 20th century, Romanticism. He talks a little bit about both European German Romanticism, English Romanticism, and American Romanticism, which was a reaction to the kind of neoclassical intellectualism of the 18th century. And at least in the case of Emersonian Romanticism, saw the world, saw nature as emblematic of God, and that human beings themselves were also possessed this sense of the deity. It was a kind of self-deifying, he believes, a self-deifying philosophy. He moves into modernism in the 20th century, which will set him up for some of his arguments against postmodernism. Modernism, generally, when we talk about the movement from the 19th century to 20th century modernism, one of the best ways, I think, to talk about it is this understanding that a change in our understanding of reality. In a pre-modernistic, generally, in a pre-modernistic perspective, reality was something that was absolute and knowable and shared. So, for instance, if something would happen up here on the stage, the belief would be anybody in this room would be able to see it and would end up talking about it in the same way. They could agree upon what had happened. So it was absolute, it was objective, and it was knowable. In modernism, with the development particularly of certain understandings in physics and psychoanalysis, there came the belief that reality, instead of being knowable and objective and absolute, was actually relative and subjective. That is, that reality depended upon the perceiver and how the perceiver constructed what would happen. So to use the same example, if something happens up here on the stage and then you would go off and talk about it with your friends or with your family, you would each talk about it in different ways. Part of it would just have to do with physical relativity. If you're sitting on this side of the room, you see it differently than if you're sitting on this side or if you're sitting up there. Part of it had to do with that inevitable subjectivity, that is the difference in the way that you make sense of the world, depending upon what you bring to it, depending upon your experience, your learning, your worldview. And so if something would happen and you'd go back and you talk about it differently, the reason you would talk about it differently, and in fact you use different language for it, would be because you're different persons and you have come to it carrying different kinds of baggage. That essentially was the difference between a modernist and a pre-modernist worldview, an understanding of reality. The postmodernists, which he's really, for reasons I'll talk about, really has to take on, extended that notion. That is, that reality was constructed by the individual perceiver, and that it was largely the result of a kind of will to power. The difference between the postmodernists and the modernists, though, generally is this, that while the modernists understood the relativity and subjectivity of reality, and often in the literature you would see, when we talk about the high modernists, Joyce and Faulkner and T.S. Eliot in certain phases of his career, even though that they believed, even though that they experimented with narrative, so it was no longer a sort of straight chronological line, beneath that fragmentation, beneath that subjectivity, there was usually a kind of coherent organizing story or myth or narrative. For Joyce, it would be myth itself. For Faulkner, it would be Old Testament narratives and so on. For the postmodernists, there was none of this underlying coherence. It simply was the construction of the individual perceiver. Now, one of the reasons that Wilson wants to reject this, and the reason that he does reject it, is one, as an empiricist, he does believe that reality is knowable. That is, physical reality is knowable, and it can be known through the scientific methodology. The reason that he has to reject a postmodernist perspective is because it would call into question that scientific worldview. It would call into question that scientific method. It would say, for instance, that a scientific worldview is simply another meta-narrative. It's another way of seeing the world. That scientists ask particular kinds of questions of reality, and so they receive certain kinds of responses to that. They come to different kinds of conclusions. Well, as an empiricist, as a materialist, Wilson is going to throw that over, right? He's just not going to mind that. And so that's why he spends those last few pages in this chapter taking on postmodern theory. Okay, and then we move on to chapter 4, which is the natural sciences. This is an interesting chapter, I think, for a number of reasons. One, he talks in it about, again, that great divide between scientific and pre-scientific cultures. What he's assuming, too, I think, on the part of the reader, and so likely your professors talked a little bit about just generally evolutionary theory, and that's typically what I do in my courses. We talk about common ancestry, the beginning of life from a common source, and then speciation, the branches of species beginning to unfold. That evolution works through, the key to it is natural selection. And so what happens is that within an environment,